There are probably a few religious traditions which are as misrepresented and misunderstood as Tantra is today. If we do just a simple Google search on the term Tantra, or if we search on any bookstore online, the vast majority of things that will come up will have something to do with sex. So tantric sex has become quite a trend in the last few decades, especially to the point that the term Tantra has almost exclusively become associated with it. In a general sense, in India as well, Tantra has often negative connotations, not only associated with sex, but also with things like magic or dark, occult things. As a result of that, it has somewhat of a bad reputation both in India and also in the West. But in fact, Tantra is so much more than this. It is a very significant religious, spiritual, and intellectual tradition that has influenced not only various strands of what we refer to as Hinduism, but also Buddhism, Jainism, and essentially most religious traditions in India. And while things like sexual rituals or magic can be part of this vast tradition, their role has been vastly exaggerated. This sadly obscures one of the most fascinating movements in the history of religion in India. In this brief presentation today, in this 1 hour and a half, we will try to dispel some of these myths and form a more comprehensive perspective. So you ask yourself, what is Tantra? Tantra, as with most things in this field, can be very hard to pin down, and it can mean many different things. To break down the word, if we were to break it down into parts, Tan and Tra. So Tan means to extend, to pull, to physically be able to apply something, consciously able to apply. So you are someone who is actively doing it. So pulling as in an action, so you are pulling something, it's not happening on its own. And the other part, Tra, is a technology. So it's an infrastructure, an architecture. It's not just a tool, it's not a technique, it's a process, it's a technology. So it's like a technology of a machinery. So Tantra means something that you can apply to something which is existing. So someone must be there to apply it, and something must be there on which the application can be applied. So the term is very broad, and it has been used in a very general sense through history to mean teachings. The Tantra, which we all talk about today, usually refers to a tradition from between the 5th and the 8th century. The teachings of Tantra were distinct from and often stand in stark contrast with the Vedic text of the Brahmanical tradition. These tantric teachings became very significant, and they were quite often popular among a wide span of people because they were very inclusive in themselves. People of all castes in India could read and engage with them since they were written in a more accessible language as opposed to the Sanskrit of the Vedas, which was a much more elitist Brahmanical tradition. So it appealed to both men and women and was generally open to participants of all walks of life. Before we continue any further, it's very important to keep in mind that terms like Tantrism is a modern, it's a modern Western contract. It is an umbrella term that is used to refer to a very wide, heterogeneous, and hard to define set of ideas and practices. The word Tantra, the Sanskrit word Tantra, has never been used in the form of ism, so the Tantrics themselves never called it Tantrism. So André Padot has an interesting paragraph on it, and I'm quoting it literally. So here is the term Tantrism was coined by Western ideologists of the later part of the 19th century, whose knowledge of India was limited and who could not realize the real nature, let alone the extent of the tantric phenomena. They believed that the practices and notions they discovered in Hindu and Buddhist texts, named Tantra, hence Tantrism, were something very particular, exceptional, and limited, contrasting sharply with the general respectable field of Indian philosophy and religion, a particular domain one could easily circumscribe. But with the progress of studies in these fields, one came to realize that apart from being a limited phenomenon, Tantrism was in fact something vast, diffuse, diverse, and very difficult task in trying to define this term. It's an incredibly complex term. There are many different schools and traditions that can often be very different from each other, so it's very hard to classify them under one explanation. So what we will do today is temporarily accept this Western term of Tantra or Tantrism and try to get an idea of what is referred to and what is meant when people talk about this term. So most likely it will be the wrong place to start from, but it's probably necessary in order to be able to reconcile it to a more acceptable and workable explanation of the term further down the line. So as tantric teachings started to emerge, they were especially associated with Shaivism, which is a religious tradition that worships Lord Shiva as a supreme god. Before we go any further into these classifications, we need just to remind ourselves of the very slippery nature of terms that end with ism, the biggest of them being Hinduism. As some of you might already know, the term Hinduism is a rather late term that really functions more as an umbrella term for a very broad range of different religious traditions in India. It consists of different religions all together. So Hinduism contains an enormous diversity of very different traditions. So there is the Brahmanical tradition connected to the Vedic scriptures and its ritual. There are many different philosophical schools such as Vaishnavism, and there is also Shaivism. The Shaivites put an emphasis on Shiva as the highest god and worship him as well as the other divine manifestations associated with him like Lord Ganesh, Mahaparvati, Mahakali, and so on. And Shaivism is rather unique among the Hindu traditions. So you might know that one thing that connects all the traditions that fall under Hinduism is their connection to the Vedic scriptures. But there are exceptions to this, and Shaivism is one such example. It should be remembered that all of these traditions mentioned before, like Vaishnavism, Shaivism, are not mutually exclusive. The lines between them are not set in stone, and the same is true even in the case of Shaivism. So there have been many attempts to connect Shaivism to the Vedas, but at its base, it has very different roots. So in Shaivism, the Vedas are not thought to be the source of the tradition. So rather than evolving around the highest caste, the Brahmans, as a Vedic religion does, Shaivism is closer to what some would call a folk religion. It's not as hierarchical and involves people from all walks of life in a more direct way. And rather than the Vedas, it is more associated with and based in scriptures and teachings of Tantra. So in this way, the Tantric teachings sometimes could even stand in contrast to the Vedas. But yet, of course, the different traditions have influenced each other, so as mentioned, there are not any lines set in stone. So even though the Tantrism is primarily associated with Shaivism and has been most influential on that movement, it is a tradition that much spans across lines of different schools and even religions. So, for example, it has also come to have a major influence on certain strands of Buddhism. For example, the Vajrayana Buddhism, which has become dominant in Tibet. So Tibetan Buddhism is highly tantric in nature. So there is Shaiva Tantra, there is the Buddhist Tantra, there is a Vaishnava Tantra, there is Jain Tantra, and so on and so on. So in other words, Tantra is a kind of a self-contained tradition of philosophy and practice that emerged in a diverse and dynamic environment and came to influence various religious traditions. So we have done a brief, very brief religious history, but the question remains: what is Tantra? What is it about? What are the characteristics of Tantra, of these tantric teachings? Well, if I could say the main feature of Tantra, if the primary feature of Tantra, is that it is very highly practical. So it places a huge emphasis on the body and the experience of the senses as a tool or as a mean to liberation. It is not just a speculative philosophy, but it takes a certain philosophy and puts it into practice. So it teaches techniques that can be employed to reach the divine and often become one with it. So there are a few things that are often characterized as being tantric in nature, which is make Tantra, as it were. So first of all, it definitely is an esoteric tradition. It is a movement that places an importance on secrecy and on teachings that are only disclosed to those that are initiated by a guru. So Tantrism involves the teacher-student relationship as a very essential component. The guru is the only person who can properly teach an initiated student the esoteric tantric practices. But what are these practices? In Tantra, there is often although not always, a focus on non-dualism or on monistic metaphysics. And the goal of tantric practices is often aimed at uniting with God or aligning one's consciousness to that essential oneness. And this is done through things like mantras, meditation, visualization practices, the use of tantras, breathing techniques, the theories and practices involving energy centers in the bodies, called chakras, the cultivation of the energy known as Kundalini, as well as fascinating forms of linguistic mysticism. Most of you most likely have heard many of these things and concepts before, as they are quite famous in many different circles, and many of them have a direct associations with Tantra and may even originate in Tantra. So to explore some of them in a bit more detail, mantras are of course very well known and used widely in different traditions. This is one of those tantric practices that goes back very far into the past, maybe even before the emergence of the tantric teachings. Some of the Vedic Upanishads, for example, talk about mantras. That is, sounds, words, and phrases that are chanted or that can have significant symbolic and practical meanings. The most famous example is Om, which according to the Upanishads has a very important role to play in the generation of the cosmos, in the creation. There is some kind of underlying cosmic sound or vibration at the core of the reality. In Tantra, different mantras are central to its practices, and these mantras have very deep meanings. Indeed, mantras in themselves are quite esoteric. They are taught by a guru to his student, and the deeper esoteric meaning of these tantras is also taught by the same guru. Other tantric practices connected to these include various breathing techniques in association with meditation as well as the mantra. Yantras or mandalas are also strongly associated with Tantra. We have all seen some of the beautiful and intricate design of yantras and mandalas in Buddhism, as well as Shaivism and other traditions. These are pictures of geometric configurations of symbols that can vary from quite simple to very intricate and detailed. The context of these yantras can vary as well. They can represent various gods, different worlds, or represent a spiritual journey among many other things. They make up a very significant part of tantric practice. Tantra also involves physiological theories regarding different energy centers in the body called chakras. There are different theories about the number of chakras, but for the purposes of this presentation we'll consider 7 of them, beginning at the base of the spine and then moving upwards, ending at the crown of the head. At the base of the spine is a kind of storage of the divine feminine energy, which is commonly called as Kundalini, meaning something like coiled, and is actually sometimes associated with a snake. Much of tantric practice, including the recitations of mantras and all other practices mentioned here, is aimed at manipulating this energy up and down these chakras in the body. The Kundalini energy at the base of the spine will then awaken and coil upwards like a snake from the base to the top and instigate a mystical experience. So what is the very famously referred to today as Kundalini experience. So this kind of knowledge made its way into various other traditions within Hinduism, such as yoga, for example. and is frequently encountered today in various new age types of movements. So this would be a good example of the already mentioned fact that Tantra, as well as related traditions like Shaivism and Shaktism, is quite practical and very bodily focused. So this, for example, be in contrast to other schools of thought within Hinduism, such as Vedanta, for example, which is often focused more on escaping the mundane, material worlds and practice renunciation. So they withdraw from the material mundane and instead focus on the spiritual side, or to reach a more spiritual state. In contrast to that, Tantra and its related traditions is very heavily focused on the body and of using the body as a vessel through which to attain enlightenment or liberation. Instead of forsaking the material, these traditions see the body as an important tool and the experience of the senses as central parts in spiritual practice. So Tantra, often conceived of the microcosm of the human body and soul as a reflection or as being identical to the macrocosm of reality. And in general, there is a huge emphasis on using the mundane to reach the supramundane. So if we were to quote Robert Brown on this, the tools in Tantrism are less doctrines and beliefs than they are concrete things that the practitioner learns to manipulate in certain specific ways, sequences, and patterns. This involves actions and processes with things being taken through time and space. Indeed, the ultimate tool in Tantra is the human body, both outside and the inside, both the anatomical body of arms, hands, tongue, heart, genitals, and the mind, and the yogic anatomy, such as chakras and nadis. It is the control of the body as a tool used to actuate processes that connect the practitioner with the universal power to reach his goal. Related to this is also the fact that most practitioners associated with Tantrism, Shaivism, and Shaktism are not renouncing ascetics but are usually normal people living a householder's life. In Shaivism, this active, creative, material part of reality in the world is identified with the feminine, divine, known as Shakti. So in Shaivism, Shiva is considered as the supreme god. Shiva is identified with things like consciousness and the self, and as awareness that is always experiencing bliss, which is identical to himself. So as always, there are different schools of Shaivism, of course. There are the Siddhanta Shaivites, which have a more classical theistic or dualistic view of Shiva as an external deity. But there is also, and perhaps more significant in relation to Tantra, a non-dualistic strand of Shaivism. So the non-dual Shaivism is an absolutely fascinating tradition, and we will go into it in much more depth into future discussions. But in brief, this school concedes of Shiva as the reality of all things. So Shiva as absolute reality is often conceived as a male and female figure. So Shiva and Shakti. Shiva is a supreme essence, consciousness, which is aware of itself, but through a vibration of this consciousness, things are created and exist within its awareness. And the active, creative part of this divinity is Shakti, the female divine counterpart which manifests in the material world. So in other words, Shiva is everything, but there are different aspects to the Supreme Being. The true form of Shiva cannot be known or grasped by our human mind. But according to available tantric texts, the feminine divine energy, Shakti, can be directly known and experienced because she is a supreme being as it manifests in the material world. The tradition that puts its emphasis on worshipping the goddess or Shakti is known as Shaktism and is a very significant in relation to Tantra. So as we can see, Tantra and the Shaivite tradition, especially in the form of Shaktism, identifies the mundane world more directly as divine or as part of the Supreme Being. So we can compare this to Advaita Vedanta, with the astige that Brahman is all there is and nothing exists outside of Brahman. But even there are figures like Shankara, for example, which make a point of the fact that our regular experience of the worlds, of the mundane, is the result of ignorance and should be discarded in a way. So this doesn't exist in Tantra or Shaivism or Shaktism. The mundane world, as experienced and in its dynamic multiplicity and bodily experience, is outright identified with the divine, is identified with God. And we can see that how this naturally leads to a perspective and practice that allows for the body and the mundane to play a much more central role. So reality in its fullness is the union of Shiva and Shakti, of the divine feminine and the divine masculine. So the supreme consciousness and its dynamic and creative manifestations. So the tantric focus on the body and metaphysical ideas presented in tradition like Shaivism and Shaktism, so allows us very nicely to circle back to our original discussion regarding practices relating to sex. It is true, as I said in the beginning, that the role of things like sexual rituals have been greatly exaggerated today by people talking about Tantra, but that isn't necessarily to say that there has been no place for that in the tantric tradition at all. Of course there has been, but it has been nowhere near as significant or central to the tradition as the many may assume today. So indeed, when we talk about Tantra, there is often talk about the so-called right and the left-hand paths. You might have heard these terms a lot in the contemporary occultism or New Age-ish related movements. But these concepts actually originate in Tantra. Important to remember is that Tantric views are often a lot more complex than a simple two-sided dichotomy. But often Tantra and related traditions were divided into the right-hand path, or the Dakshinachara, and the left-hand path, the Vamachara. So the right-hand path is associated with practices that are more orthodox or that follow the cultural and the religious norm of that particular society. So most of the regular religious practices that you think of, like prayer, offerings, or any such things, fall under the category of the right-hand path. The left-hand path, on the other hand, is associated with heterodox practices, rituals or tendencies that are often taboo or considered extreme by outsiders. So in the Tantric and the Shaivism tradition, these can include spiritual practices that are antinomian, so they go against the norms. And there are very much taboo things like drugs, alcohol, even things involving dead bodies, and indeed things like sexual rituals too. So a famous contemporary example, one which you most likely have seen in many YouTube videos, of a left-hand tradition of Shaivism are the Agoris. So you have seen them performing such things as meditating on dead bodies, smearing themselves with human ashes, and they do all this in an attempt to collapse the distinction between pure and impure in order to recognize the non-dual nature of reality and Shiva. So this has been an important part of the tantric practices as well. So the so-called left-hand path of the antinomian practices that go against the norms and are sometimes considered taboo. Important to remember is that this is indeed only one school or tendency within this tradition and does not present all of the Shaivism or Tantrism. But there is indeed another tradition like the Kaula, a certain school of non-dual and often Shakti-oriented Shaivism that we see the practice of sexual rituals. So this is a very complex and intricate topic with both physical and metaphysical implications. And we can see how it naturally stems from the tantric focus on the body as a very important vessel for spiritual development and enlightenment. The experience of sex is indeed one of the most powerful sense experiences we can have as human beings. In these traditions, though, it will often be emphasized that these practices are never about pleasure. So often rituals involving sex are always held in very controlled environments under the supervision of a guru and are only performed when the practitioners have reached a state where he or she doesn't get absorbed by the physical or the central pleasure of the act. But instead, the sexual act becomes symbolic, mirroring the nature of Shiva and reality. In Shaivism, there is an important idea of divine masculine and feminine, Shiva and Shakti uniting as an essential aspect of divinity and reality. So the earthly sexual act becomes a mirroring of this union, the union of masculine and feminine. And for the human practitioner, it's a disappearance of separateness in that union, which also become a kind of union with the divine itself, and that can thus serve as a very important catalyst for spiritual transformation. Indeed, sexual symbolisms and expressions is quite common in the Shaivism tradition in general. We can see it in various pieces of art, and there is pronounced eroticism in these art forms on display a lot of the time. So this is a characteristic of a lot of Shaivism in comparison to other Hindu traditions. Its expressions are often very colorful. They can be violent, scary, and overly sexual, which all represents important factors and aspects of divinity in a metaphorical sense, but also non-metaphorical, so of this world. So you can see there definitely have existed ritual and expressions related to sex within the strands of Tantra, but its role in the West has been hugely exaggerated. Only in the 20th century, with figures like Alistair Crowley, Kenneth Grant, and other similar figures, that this strong connection has started to develop. In Western esotericism and in New Age kind of movements, Tantrism has thus become limited to its sexual aspects, which historically has only served as one relatively very significant part of a vast tradition of ritual practices and ideas. So to summarize, Tantrism is a very difficult concept to grasp, and the term itself, Tantrism, is just a modern scholarly Western construct that tries to encapsulate a very broad and heterogeneous tradition that spans across the religions of Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism. Tantra, in its core, is this sophisticated and ancient technology. It's a tool, an equipment of the spirit, crafted by the ancient sages. This technology was designed not just for the mere manipulation of the material world, which is how it's used these days by most tantric circles, unfortunately. The sages crafted it for a far more ambitious purpose: the transformation of the self, the transcendence of the soul. So those ancient teachings, that wisdom of authentic teachings, will help us steer away from the misconception and towards the depth of true understanding. Tantra is the tool, so it's the boat capable of bearing you, the seeker, the practitioner, across the river of turmoil in life. However, this journey is also quite dangerous. It's dangerous for those who are deeply connected to their earthly desires. The deeper you go into this journey, the more you will shed your artificial constructs, those artificial, egoistic constructs which have accompanied you for your entire life up to this point. So this is easier said than done, and is in fact shocking for most individuals. So throwing away from your core the labels, the masks that you have been wearing through your entire life, it's a very painful experience and can lead most to disarray. This is why you might have heard that it is often said that this journey is for the courageous. The tantric journey is only for the courageous. To navigate it, you must deeply grasp its application and diligently practice the tantric methods. Those methods offer you the freedom to explore, to find a place you can truly call home. In the heart of Tantra lies the dynamic interplay of energy and consciousness. Through rigorous practices, we will learn how to harness these cosmic forces, how to channel them towards the goal of achieving mukti, the liberation. It is in those silent moments of self-reflection, in that sacred space of inner stillness, that Tantra reveals its true power. It reveals the ability to transform that raw lead of human experience into the goal of spiritual awakening. So we will aim to achieve that awakening through a mix of techniques, and in our tradition, in the tradition of the Sarala Kul, there exists a multitude of such techniques. These techniques are designed to harness the chaos within and to focus the mind in the midst of our life's disorder. With continued practice and dedication to these techniques, the seeker, the practitioner, will attain mukti, the liberation, so the liberation from the tumultuous dance of thoughts in our mind. So we will be able to step into a state of serene clarity. As we will incorporate those techniques, those practices in our daily lives, you'll be able to experience the breakthrough, the transcendence beyond the visible and the tangible. The foundation of being able to grasp any of these techniques is the ability to maintain focused attention. That is the essence of attaining yoga. Yoga is the ancient Sanskrit term for union. So to attain yoga is to achieve union, that harmonious balance between the body and consciousness. Mastering this ability to maintain the focus is known as dharana, a word roughly meaning profound concentration. The holding focus amidst this cacophony of our monkey mind is a formidable challenge. So this practice begins with a meditation technique, so striving to maintain concentration even as disorder reigns in our minds and in our lives. It's a simple but very powerful technique which we will be going through in our upcoming programs and discussions. So we will delve much deeper into that meditation technique, into its application, and we'll be meditating upon the layers of self and the essence of focus. So we hope that this initial presentation has made you interested to continue exploring this journey and into learning more about these practices and technique and how to apply them in your daily lives. So we look very much forward to continue this communication, and please keep an eye out there for our next series of programs where the wisdom of the tradition of the Sarala Kul